Welcome back to Mastering Next.js. In this module, we're going to be talking about authentication. So we're going to talk about what is a JWT, pronounced JOT. We're going to talk about one provider called Auth0, another one called Firebase, and then finally we're going to implement Firebase and do some login and sign up pages around the Daydrink application that we started in a previous module. So first, let's touch on what is a JOT and why you would need to use one. So JOTs, which are JSON Web Tokens, allow you to securely transmit information between two parties as a JSON object. So with the rise of JavaScript, I feel like it really fueled the fire for JOTs becoming more popular, just because you could just send things as JSON. And this is probably one of the most popular ways to do authentication in the industry. So it's good to know what it is and good to know how to use it for authentication. Typically what this might look like is, once a user logs in, each one of the subsequent requests would then include this JOT, and that would allow the user to access specific routes or services or resources that are permitted using that token. So that JOT defines kind of the contract for how that user interacts with the application. Now there are three parts to a JOT, and this website, jwt.io, gives us a really helpful debugger where you can copy paste a JOT in, an encoded one, and it will spit out the three different parts. So those parts are a header, a payload, and then the signature. Now the header is the type of token we're using and then what algorithm we're using. The payload is the information or the claims that we want to include in our JOT. And then finally, the signature is an encoded version of the header, an encrypted version of the payload, some secret, and the algorithm that was specified in the header, and this all gets signed. Now the JOT gets compiled together with the header as base 64, the payload as base 64, and the signature as base 64, and they're all separated by dots. Now typically you would see this used using the authorization header and the bearer schema. So it would look something like authorization, bearer, and then your token. And that would be passed around in your request to define that contract for your application. Now, one solution that can be used for authorization and authentication that uses JOTs is Auth0. It's one of the more popular solutions in the industry, and it does work with Next. And I would say if you're a medium to large sized company, you might be using something like this. What I've found for personal projects and getting off the ground, there's a little bit higher barrier of entry with Auth0 to some of the other auth providers, which is why we're going to also talk about Firebase next. But I want to show an example of what Auth0 looks like integrated with Next, and just so you know exactly what that looks like. And this code is part of the Next.js examples. They have a really great directory of a bunch of different use cases. And the reason I like this example specifically is because it makes good use of API routes and prevents you from having to override the server and have your own custom server. So if we dive into the lib folder, library folder, the first thing we're going to look at is this Auth0 file, which takes in the config values for whether you're on the client or the server and initializes Auth0. So this is pretty much just putting in those variables. As I mentioned, the config, depending on whether you're on the server or the client, there's going to be different variables that you're going to pass in to set things up. And then this is where it's maybe a little bit more complex than the Firebase example, which is we're going to have to communicate with these API routes that we've created to fetch information, and then we have a React hook use fetch user, which allows us to then store that information in state. That part will be a little bit similar. So let's go look at those API routes. For example, to log in, basically API/login, we're going to call handle login on the Auth0 SDK that we've set up. And if there's any errors, we'll log that out. Very similar functionality for log out. And this was the /API/me was what was hit when we were setting up Auth0 inside of that hook. There's also a callback after you've logged in, which redirects you back to whatever route you want. In this case, we're just redirecting back to the root. And you can actually pull this down, run it locally, and kind of see what this flow looks like. For me, I chose to use Firebase instead of Auth0 for the example application that I included. So we're going to go into that a little bit further, but I just wanted to give a quick overview of what this looks like and a place for you to reference the code if you do end up wanting to use Auth0. So as I mentioned, I chose to use Firebase. Part of the reason is that I was a bit more familiar with Firebase. I had used it in the past, but also that once you've got an account created and a project created with Firebase, there's a lot of other functionality that you can use in Firebase's comprehensive platform. So as you can see here, there's a variety of different things you can do, not only authentication, but another one that I'm using in the Daydrink application is this cloud storage, which is allowing me to host some images. And really, you could do a lot more here. You could host your application here as well if you wanted. You could have a real-time database. There's a lot of functionality you can do here, but that's one of the things I liked about Firebase is having that ability, but also just the GUI and the interaction of managing the users, as well as the code to do it was a bit more simple in this case than Auth0. So that's why I chose to use Firebase. And under the hood, Firebase uses JOTs for its authentication. So you have these ID tokens that are created when a user signs into an application. These are signed JOTs that will identify someone in that Firebase project. And they're going to contain, just really basic information about that user, the user ID, and basically these get verified through Firebase. There's also identity provider tokens if you're using other types of logins like Google or Facebook. We're just going to be doing email password for this example. And then you can also do custom tokens as well, but we don't need to get into that. We're going to stick with the most basic example to get us off the ground here. Now, I already have a project set up and I have some fake users created, and this is what the dashboard for Firebase looks like. So you can quickly search for people through email or phone number or whatever you want to do by their user ID, and you can see things are securely stored inside of Firebase, and you can see that we're just doing email right now. The nice thing is you could extend this and do all sorts of different sign-in providers if you want. For me, we're just going to stick with a simple example for right now. But it's nice to know that you have the ability to scale this out further if you want to. It even has sign-in with Apple, which is pretty cool. So we have the project set up. I've already set up our application with all of the secrets so that it can communicate with Firebase. But now how do we actually integrate with that Firebase SDK so that we can create users, login users, and the works there? Before we do that, I want to show an example of what this looks like and how you might use it. So here's the landing page for the application. I've chosen to make it behind a login. So if I try to go look at the specific deals, I'm not going to be able to interact with these or vote on these until I'm logged in. And the nice thing about the way we have this code set up is that I can use hooks to conditionally pop a modal if a user's not logged in. So if I try to vote here, it's going to recognize that I'm not logged in and then prompt me to sign up for the service. Same thing if I tried to add a deal, and I'm able to compose and reuse this functionality across different places of the website. Now, if I go back to the home page and I say, let's get started, this is actually going to do a full redirect to a sign up page and use the same code that was inside of the modal, this auth section with the the form to sign up, but it's actually taken over as a full screen page. Now this same thing exists for a full screen sign up or sign in page too if you wanted. So we're going to talk about sign up, sign in, and then once I got into the application, I would be able to be signed in and then interact with these deals and upvote, downvote, or create new ones. Now, the base for how we're interacting with Firebase actually came from a website called Use Hooks. So shout out to Gabe for providing this code for how you can very cleanly interact with this Firebase SDK with one custom hook. And that's what we're going to jump into right now. I have a file called Auth, and I nested it under a utils folder. And this file takes care of the full life cycle of sign in, sign out, sign up, password resets, basically anything we want to do here. And it's composable such that I can just call use auth, get access to this state of the user that's logged in, as well as all the different methods that I want to use to perform actions on that user. So if we start at the top, the first thing we're doing here is initializing Firebase with the settings specific to the environment we're in. So right now, I just have this set up as the prod environment. You could also set this up to have a staging environment or different settings if you're running locally. But the first thing we do here is we initialize it. I'm not going to do a deep dive into React context here because we're going to cover that in a later module. But what we need to know here is think about context as a way to store state across our application. So we are making a provider that is making the user object available in different parts of the application. So to tap into that context, we're going to have a use auth hook, which then references the context of what user is logged in. So first things first, we define the user and then a way to modify the user and put it in state so that it persists throughout the application. And then the Firebase SDK has some built-in helper methods that allow you to do things like sign in using an email or password, create user with an email or password, sign out, and we define each of these as their own functions so that we can return them as part of the hook and call them conditionally whenever we need to. So basically we call this SDK, and then if there was a successful response, then we set the user with that new user that we retrieved back from the response. Same thing for sign in and sign up. For sign out, we're setting the user to false because we want to get rid of that user. And then I won't show an example of this, but it's nice to have this code ready for when you get to this step, but you could do password resets and the confirmation of doing that. The last piece is down here at the bottom, which is how we handle unsubscribing when our application is disposing of this hook. So we set up an effect that says when the auth state changes, if there's a user, we're going to populate the state with that new user. Otherwise, we're going to dispose of the current user. And then we return that unsubscribe function. Finally, we return this object that has the user ID and then all of the different methods that we have available to call inside of this custom hook. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we would actually consume this, and let's look at the sign in page. So the way I have this set up, it's underneath pages/sign in. So as I showed, if I go directly to this, I'm tapping into 3 different hooks. The use auth hook that I just showed, use toast from Chakra, which allows us to show an error message if something was wrong, and then finally use router from Next, which will allow us to redirect if the login was successful. So we define sign in that we're going to tap into the auth hook, pass in this email and password. If it was successful, we want to redirect to the deals page. Otherwise, say that an error occurred and give back a more specific message from Firebase. So let's give this a shot. Let's say I put in a bogus email and some bogus password and I try to sign in. I'm going to get an error from Firebase saying there's no user record corresponding to this, may have been deleted. I could also do my email where I have a user but a bogus password, and it says that the password is invalid or the user does not have a password. So our error state is working here. Our toast message is correctly popping us to show us when there's a problem. But let's see what happens when it works successfully. So I put in the right password, I hit sign in. The next router is going to then, typo. So the next router is then going to redirect us to the deals page. And now I have the ability to interact with these deals, do voting, and add new deals, and that auth wall has been taken down. Now you might be wondering, what is this auth component that we have created here? If I go back to sign in, you'll see that I specify the type is sign in, and then what happens when we actually hit submit. This is a nice wrapper that I made for this form specifically. So let's dive into here. We're looking at a full screen auth, which basically has some styling, and then it's using the content of the auth, which is the form, the errors that get passed in, and then when something changes, we're going to call the submit on the form to communicate with Firebase. Now you might be wondering, well, why do you have this full screen auth and then auth component as a sub component here? And the main reason is the composition of different components. This auth content, the actual form logic, is defined here such that we can use it in not only a full screen auth, we can use it inside of an auth modal for specific pieces of the application, and we can also use it inside of this hook to pop up that auth modal, or we can even do redirects as part of a custom hook as well too, using that modal. So this goes back to the example that I showed where, if you try to upvote or if you try to add a deal, it's going to pop this modal instead of completely taking you out of the context of the application. So let's take a look at what this content is. But first, I need to talk about how we're managing the state of this form. And to do that, we're using a library called React Hook Form. Now, if you've ever worked with forms, you know that they are deceptively complex. It seems really easy, right? You just have, a couple inputs, couple buttons, and it should just take, a small amount of time. Well, the reality is there's a lot to consider. Not only do you have actually capturing those values, you have error states, you have, conditionally showing logic, and all of that hopefully in a composable piece so that you can reuse it in multiple places inside of your application. Now there's a few different ways that you can do hooks with React. You can manage that entire error state, submit state yourself using just React state, or you can utilize some of these third-party libraries that allow you to simplify some of this. And I've actually really started to like React Hook Form after using things like Redux in the past or even Formic. Both are good, but I think that React Hook Form has slimmed down the API a little bit, and so far it's worked well for the use cases that I needed. So if I pop open this full screen example here of what the React Hook Form looks like, you'll see that I tap in and I pull off 3 different properties from this hook, submitting the form, registering the fields, and then the errors that could come back if something was wrong. In this example, they're just logging out what the values are on submit, but you'll see that for each input here, each one gets registered. You can provide some additional options for how you want to register those inputs, and then the button of type submit actually triggers this form, triggers this submit event, and then it calls this function. So that's the premise of how you actually do form management with this. Now let's take a look over on the right of what we're doing in the Daydream codebase. So in each one of these different scenarios, whether it's a full screen auth or it's an auth modal, I'm calling the use form hook and I'm getting access to submitting, registering, and the errors. And I pass those into the auth content. There's 2 different fields here, the email and the password, and I register each one of these as required so that if I were to try and not provide one of these, it would say, this field is required, here's the error message that needs to show, and display that message below the input if there is an error. And again, this is populated by that errors field. Now, each one of these keys in this errors object are from the name that we specify. So since this is named email, it's going to be errors dot whatever that field is, and then the message that we receive back. Finally, you see we have a type of submit on the button, and to make this dynamic, we pass in what type of input it is, so we can either do sign in or sign up or something further. And then the entire form then is able to handle the submit and call whatever custom functionality we want to do when that button is clicked. So for example, in this with auth modal, you'll see that on submit, we're going to do a sign up, and it's got very similar logic to the full-fledged sign-in page that we defined. So now with this auth modal defined, it's really easy then to wrap things behind this, like the voter or the deal modal, such that if that user isn't provided, we can just wrap this entire component and it will pop up that modal and not proceed if the user is not found. So that is a really quick overview of how you can do authentication in your apps. It doesn't need to be as complex as a lot of people make it. And thankfully, the state of front-end development and some of these solutions like Firebase and Auth0 have made it much easier to do user management and to get your application started up really quickly, even do different environments if you want to, and build out these full-scale applications really quick. So the combination of Firebase plus this custom hook and using components like Chakra UI that will allow you to build out these forms even easier just really expedites the process for going from zero to application that has full sign-in, sign-out flows. Now, I want to mention one other alternative to building these flows yourself. So rather than actually creating these sign-in components that have the email and password and have your own branding, if you want, you can just use Firebase UI components that will give you those for free, and you don't have to do any of the custom styling yourself. I know that Auth0 also allows you to redirect back to their login page, which will handle all of the stylings and inputs for you so that you don't have to have any of that custom code. This comes with pros and cons, obviously. For some people, it's going to be quicker to get off the ground and they don't want to manage that code. For me personally, I like being able to have complete control, not only over how these pages looks and the branding, but also maybe there's some custom functionality that I want to happen, like when the user signs in, I want confetti to pop. And when I completely own this flow, I have the ability to customize it exactly as I need. Okay, so that wraps up the authentication module. We've talked about what a JOT is, why you might want to use one, a couple different providers, Auth0 and Firebase, and then finally how you can interact with that Firebase SDK using a React hook to really simplify that process and wrap specific items behind authentication flow, or even create routes like a sign in or a sign up form and add users to your Firebase database. So with that, thanks for tuning in and stay tuned for the next module. Cheers.